Okay, hi Faith. Thanks for joining me on the Western Canon podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
No problem. So I want to start with some background. Your book is called Saving Cinderella: What Feminists Get Wrong About Disney Princesses and How to Set It Right. And that's the book right there. Can you hold it up right in front of the camera so that listeners can see?
Yeah, there it is.
That's the
Yeah.
book. Go out and buy it. Give it a review on Amazon.
Yes.
Okay. So I just had a chance to read most of your book, almost done with it. So in the introduction of your book, you basically say that through these Disney films, we learn how a brave, determined girl with a strong moral core could overcome obstacles and achieve her dreams. So you say, in essence, we learned how to grow up into strong, centered, moral women. So what happened, Faith? What happened? What happened to the Disney films?
Yeah, it's kind of a tragedy, really. Um, early on, the very first Disney princess film that came out was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and that came out in the late 1930s. And it was the very first animated feature-length film ever created, and it was this amazing experiment that Walt Disney did that obviously was a huge success. And back then, the princess films that were made under Walt Disney were Snow White, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty, and those were huge successes and were beloved all throughout history, etc. And then there was this kind of huge gap in the princess film world of Disney. And 30 years later, the Disney Renaissance happened, which began in 1989 with The
That's
Little
part two
Mermaid.
of your book.
Exactly, part two. So, and then you get The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and those kind of amazing, wonderful films. But within that 30-year gap, the entire second wave of feminism happened. And so, sorry.
Oh, what you have
So,
there? I
oh,
saw the cup.
this is my bell cup. I have it with me always when I
Great.
do any of these interviews. Um, yeah. So
Boring
the
mug here.
boring mug, excellent. We all must have some kind of boring mug or bell mug.
Gray manly mug.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, so Disney wasn't thinking about feminism, but he was thinking about women, and he was thinking about princesses and what all of that meant. He was thinking about fairy tales, which obviously is a sort of genre of literature that has existed for thousands of years and is well established, and he was definitely thinking about that. And I think once once he was gone, and once people really were thinking about feminism, it started to kind of inject itself into these films. At first, um, it was kind of great in the sense that it took these stories out of the symbolic kind of the tropes and the symbols that were there in the original movies and obviously in the original fairy tales into this kind of amazing real life, much more realistic. Obviously, they're still cartoons, but much more realistic world of, what are these characters' real motivations? Who are these people really? What's going on here? And that was amazing. But then, in my book, I call them the princess critics. There are these sort of, it's a vocal minority essentially of feminist critics who took a look at these films and said, this doesn't jive with our ideology at all. They looked at the ways that, oh, these people are always falling asleep, and nothing, and the whole action of the movie takes place without them, or they just sit around waiting for a guy, and they Ariel gives up her voice to get a guy, and all of this stuff, and they basically they totally misread these stories and these films, and they wrote their reviews and they gave their interviews and they did all of this stuff, and because their opinions kind of jived with the publications that they were being published in, they got the word out there, and it sort of became the accepted opinion about these stories and these characters, and that kind of resonated with Disney. And Disney was like, uh-oh, Disney the studio, not the guy, he's dead, but the studio was like, uh-oh, the New York Times and the Washington Post and Time Magazine are running these articles about how awful princesses are and fairy tales are. We have to do something, or we're going to
Right.
lose our audience, essentially. So then we start to get these princesses like Merida from Brave and, Elsa from Frozen and
Right.
Pocahontas and all of these women that are basically these sort of warrior women who don't need a man and all of this stuff that try to kind of refute all of those ideas. But in reality, they kind of set up this horrible roadmap for women. So it's kind of
Right.
it's kind of
So they decided that if they didn't get woke, they were going to go broke. I want to give a quote from your book, from the introduction. You said the shift that you're talking about began with a small but very vocal minority of radical feminists who misunderstood the movies, and you call them princess critics. I wanted to touch on that because there are very few things in the book that I disagree with, but one of them is I thought that you were actually too soft on the princess critics. Now you would give a quote from one of their reviews, and then you would say, "What is this person talking about?" And you would certainly refute them adeptly, and it was really nice to see. But why princess critics? Why not something a bit more direct and biting, right? I always loved Harold Bloom's The School of Resentment to talk about an entire class of intellectuals who are basically taking an approach to the Western canon that is fundamentally resentful and deconstructive and all of this. I mean, these princess critics are trying to destroy something that's fundamentally good, right? What say you to that?
Yeah, I actually think that they don't really understand what they're doing. So I think that I have a little bit of sympathy for them in the sense that I think that somehow, maybe from a lack of sort of education in the Western canon, right? I think that they don't actually understand what a fairy tale is or what it does. I think they totally miss any of the symbolic elements. I think they don't understand anything about archetypes. I think they don't understand what is going on in a fairy tale, and I definitely think they don't understand what is going on in the early Disney movies, which are almost just, they're not quite just sort of movies of the fairy tale. They're not just retellings of the fairy tale. There's something else going on, but they're so much closer to the originals than, say, even like the Beauty and the Beast movie, for example. And the reason I think that is that when they start to make movies that aren't based on a fairy tale, an actual fairy tale, but are sort of reminiscent of a fairy tale, for example, Brave, there's no fairy tale about that story, but it's obviously meant to sort of evoke a fairy tale world and fairy tale ideas. But everything in that movie that corresponds to a fairy tale idea is completely misguided and insane. And it just tells me that, Brenda Chapman is who wrote and created that story. Like, she has absolutely no idea what she's talking about. And she gives these interviews where she's like, I looked and looked for a story about a mother and a fairy tale about a mother and a daughter, and I just couldn't find one. It's like, yeah, there's a reason that you couldn't find one. There's a reason for that. But she doesn't know that. So I think the reason that I sort of am not calling them, sort of like evil destroyers of all that's good in the world for little girls, and the reason I'm calling them princess critics is because I think they know not what they do. I think that they really legitimately think, they're really legitimately looking at these stories and thinking, oh my gosh, this is horrible. I really need to sort of save the little girls of the world from these horrible ideas that are out there. And I think, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I think there's a lot of people out there that sort of call themselves feminists, and they want to be good feminists, and they want to teach their daughters and their sons the sort of correct way to be in the world. And they hear that these stories are so terrible, and so they sort of ban them from their homes, or they talk about them in these ways where, that are kind of out of touch. And I just, my hope is that somebody like that will read it and sort of see like, oh, okay, actually, these stories are okay and good for these reasons, So I kind of have a little sympathy for them, I guess.
So I'm going to quote your book again. You say, and I think this is near the beginning, you say, quote, "These princess critics took a look at the original princesses like Snow White and Cinderella, and even the more modern princesses like Ariel and Belle, and deemed them anti-feminist. They called them damsels in distress and proclaimed that they had no agency in their own lives and needed a man to take care of everything for them. They boiled the princesses' dreams down to husband hunting and said they would settle for the first guy that came along. They called them drips and said they were boring and branded them as terrible role models for little girls. So, Faith Moore, why is this critique wrong? Can you give me kind of an account of where you go with this in your book? Why is this account of Disney princesses wrong and Disney films wrong?
Yeah, so this idea about the man and they only want a man is kind of like the number one complaint that we get about,
Sure,
about
yeah.
princesses. And I would say that they certainly want to find love because they're human beings and
Right.
human beings want to find love. And I think that there's not only is there nothing wrong with that, I think
I don't
that
know,
that's
some of those feminists,
good. Right, exactly.
maybe
I mean,
not.
I think this is a problem. I think it's like it's sort of equating like I don't need a man with like I don't want one at all, and I think that's definitely happening in our culture right now.
Yeah.
And I don't think that those two things are the same at all. And so I think that's the first part is that if the criticism is, oh my gosh, all of these princesses want to get married, then my answer to that is like, yes, so do I, so do lots of people.
Which
There's
is
nothing wrong.
it's so overcompensatory too, because when I think about it in reverse, yes, I need my wife. I
Of course,
desperately need my wife. And
of course.
um
And she needs you. I mean,
yeah,
it's both, right?
right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So I think there's that. But I also think that this idea that, because a lot of the early movies and of course the original fairy tales, there's this trope of love at first sight. And I think that these critics see that and they think like, oh, this is just some sort of physical attraction going on. And they're just kind of like waiting for the richest, handsomest guy to come along and marry them so that they can be rich and wear nice clothes. And isn't that great? But that obviously isn't true for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that pretty much everything that goes on in a fairy tale is symbolic of something else. I mean, everything. So when, for example, Cinderella, when her rags are transformed into a beautiful ball gown and off she goes to the ball, and the first thing that happens is the prince goes like, yeah, you, and she goes, yeah, you, that's not like a story about the importance of clothes and how they can attract a mate. That's not what it's about. The fairy godmother transforms Cinderella so that the outside world can see her inner beauty that's been there all along, right? It's a moment of transformation. And when she wears her inner beauty on the outside, the prince sees it and he recognizes her as a person of worth. I mean, how many other beautiful girls were at that party?
right.
Like, it's obviously not like, oh, I'm just looking for a cute girl and all of you are ugly. It's not that at all. He sees that magic that the godmother, put there. And so love at first sight is a symbol for that. It's a sort of fairy tale trope that means that. So
Right.
that's one.
What else?
Okay. The other thing is that I don't know of a Disney princess pre-Pocahontas whose dream is to find a guy. Every single other Disney princess before like 1998 has a specific and very real dream. It has nothing to do with a man.
Right.
And the man kind of comes in and either is like a force of motivation for her, which romantic love often is. And
Or
people,
it's serendipitous, right? They just encounter each other and then
right.
they fall in love.
Well, in those instances, it's almost always symbolic. So a lot of times the man represents the woman's or the girl's readiness to be a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Not because like, oh, to be a woman, you have to have a man, but it's symbolic of the fact that when a girl transitions to womanhood, she is now physically able to have a baby, and have a baby, you need a man. Sorry, feminist. And, so that's just symbolic. And that's why the prince kind of like shows up randomly at the end of some of these, like in Snow White. Snow White is basically an allegory for puberty. So the guy just kind of shows up. And in the original one, she hasn't even met him before. He just kind of shows up and he's like, yeah, I'll take her. And it's because we're supposed to get that like, oh, okay, she's transitioned from child to woman. And that's just the symbol of that. So I think a couple of things are going on. One is that the critics don't understand the symbols at all. And the other is that they're not really carefully watching these movies or reading these stories. I mean, think about what does Snow White want? Snow White wants to escape her horrible stepmother, who is intent on keeping her a child forever. And she goes out and she rescues herself essentially by meeting up with some guys and offering her marketable skills in exchange for shelter.
Definitely.
She totally does. Cinderella, she wants to regain her status as a noblewoman, right? Sleeping Beauty, she wants, she wants to live out her life as a, happy peasant woman in the woods. I mean, they all have, and then when you get to like the Renaissance princess, they really have dreams. I mean, Ariel her dream is to be a human being. Belle wants to get out of this town where nobody understands her.
That's
Jasmine,
Pinocchio, right? She wants to be a human being. She wants to be a real person, right? So one of the things I do like about your book is what you were just mentioning is that you make the case that these classic Disney films are written and structured to be fairy tales, classic fairy tales. Your book, it starts out kind of with your sort of vague argument about, as introductions do, about what you're doing and what your project is. And then what I love about your book is it gets really specific, chapter by chapter. I didn't expect that. I thought it was going to be kind of a bird's eye view. You actually zoom in close in your book and you analyze each one of the Disney princess films. That was really cool. And you make the case that these are classic fairy tales. You draw on classic fairy tales, and you make sort of the case that modern feminist critics are viewing these fairy tales through a 21st century woke lens, when this is completely inappropriate, given the symbolic, the archetypal, the didactic purpose of these stories. And I want to quote your book here. You write, fairy tales work in a very specific way. And then you go on to say a fairy tale is a very specific kind of story, a kind of story that Snow White's original audience in 1937 would have been intimately familiar with, but which, judging by their reactions, the princess critics know nothing about. And at a certain point in your book, you say, wouldn't it be great if they would take a time out from their feminist dance theory classes, grievance classes, women's studies classes, you say gender studies classes, and if they would just take a literature course. But I will admit, I have a degree in philosophy and a degree in literature, from having a degree in literature that I received, I don't know, 5 years ago. Even then, getting a degree in English is basically getting a degree in cultural studies, feminist studies, grievance studies. How do we get this back? This understanding that there are timeless stories, there are timeless archetypes. We do have a human nature, so things are always going to be relevant to us. We're not infinitely malleable. I feel like in your book, you're almost explaining. You're explaining things that were obvious to us 50 years ago, and I'm glad that you did it. What do we do? This seems like a crisis of meaning here.
Yeah, well, the first thing you can do is read my book.
Of course.
And once you've done that, no, I mean, and I think you're right. I think it's hard even in literature classes. I mean, I have a degree in English literature also, and there was a lot of feminist stuff going on there. I mean, I also, I also sort of got the basics too, and I think, I think that they're there. You just need to take those classes, and they're not always required necessarily.
They're dwindlingly fewer and fewer by the year, those classes.
Right. And but I also think, read books, read other books. To write this book, I read a lot of books. I mean, one book I read that was great that a lot of people don't know so much about is called Spinning Straw into Gold. It's by Joan Gould. And she actually has a lot of feminist things to say, but she's really balanced and reasonable, and talks a lot about these kind of the symbols and the tropes and the archetypes and things like that. I love that. I mean, obviously, Bruno Bettelheim's uses of enchantment is dated, and he was kind of like a Freudian in a lot of ways, and we don't really.
I don't know that. What is that?
Oh, it's called The Uses of Enchantment. It's by Bruno Bettelheim. He was a child psychologist back in many years ago. I don't exactly know what
20th century, early 20th
yeah,
century.
something like that. His ideas are very kind of Freudian and a little bit kind of silly to us, but he also talks about kind of the symbolism and also the best part of his book is kind of what these stories mean to children. And there's a lot of literature out there about that from psychologists and, literature people, like critics and things like that about what children get from these stories. Because, the original stories are actually really strange to us. If you read like the Brothers Grimm or something like that, it's like, that's weird. Like
Yeah,
they're
totally.
very, very odd, and
Yeah.
people are doing some really strange stuff. I mean, people are marrying inanimate objects, and they're like talking to animals that don't turn into people. I mean, it's very, very
And
strange.
that's more evidence for you in your case that these stories don't mean what they literally say on the page. There's
Exactly.
subtext, there's deeper symbolism.
Exactly. And I think, right, and that's kind of, it doesn't take much sort of reading I mean, obviously people should also read the original stories, and because it doesn't take much reading of these stories or some critique of these stories to kind of figure that out. And so I think once you kind of get that idea in your head, there's a lot out there that you can kind of track down to read about this. And then once you've got that idea in your head, I think you're good. I think you're sort of golden, because I think once you see that, like you just said, once you see that, like, okay, obviously this isn't promoting that we marry like stoves or what, things, like things that happen in these stories, then you're kind of like, okay, what are they talking about? And then you're sort of like, you're woke in the other sense. You're kind of, you figured it out that,
Right.
you're on the wrong track and you need to get back on track, I think.
So your book is really, really timely. You were probably pleased to see that there was kind of a resurgence of criticizing, the classic Disney films, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I know about you from listening to your dad, who's mentioned you a couple of times, and then he pointed me, as I'm listening to his show, to a Wall Street Journal article, and I read that, and I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? We're talking about these Disney films again, so it does seem really timely. And then Keira Knightley comes out and says that she refuses to show The Little Mermaid to her child because Ariel gives up her voice for a man.
Right.
Instantly, when I saw that, I said, oh my God, you can't be that brainless. There's no way that you genuinely think that that doesn't have a deeper meaning and that that's like that narrow lens. And then, of course, Kristen Bell came out, which is a darn shame because I like her as an actress.
Yeah.
She jumps on this bandwagon criticizing Snow White. It's like, why are we litigating art from the past because it fails to live up to our woke 21st century standards of equity and propriety? I do not understand how they can be intellectually honest about that. It seems silly. I'm going to read a quote from your book. You say, it's radical, I know, to say this, but Disney princesses aren't anti-feminist. And so my first reaction was like, yeah, of course, totally agree with you. Like, I'm a first, maybe halfway second wave feminist. Like, I'm like there with a lot of it. Women should be treated equally and should have equal rights, and insofar as it's possible, equal opportunity. But the choice is theirs and all of this. And it's great if you want to be a mother. It's great if you want to delay that to have a career. Everything's good, right? But we're in this brave new world, right? We're in this new place where that's not even acceptable, right? So you say your line of reasoning, your argument is essentially, no, guys, these Disney princesses aren't anti-feminist. I'm going to push back just a little bit because I was actually surprised that you took that line of attack. Part of me thinks that this cultural battle is too big for the types of words that you're using, right? You're calling the radical feminists that write these influential pieces in HuffPo and the New York Times, pieces that my students are reading, right? The Washington Post, Salon. You're calling them princess critics, and you're saying, look, guys, the Disney princesses really are feminists. Please don't hurt my Disney princesses, right? So, and I'm sort of kidding, but at the same time, part of me thinks, in a way, like the book was fantastic. There was, at times, I wanted you to bend the stick harder in the opposite direction. Right, that in order to make ground on this issue, we kind of have to basically come out and say, not just that the classic Disney princesses aren't anti-feminist, but that your version of feminism is wrong, and it isn't really feminism, and your vision of the world won't make women happy. And most women secretly agree with you, Faith. They do. Most women love these story. In other words, what I see as being incredibly valuable about your book, beyond the fact that it's tremendously enjoyable and satisfying to read, is that your book, at least in my opinion, is, I actually disagree with you. I think it's speaking to people that already agree with you, which is many people, right? I think that you're giving women and men who love the classic Disney films good arguments to stand up for themselves for once and for all.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is absolutely, I would say, the main audience for the book. And when I was talking earlier about, I hope that some of these princess critics read it and figure that out. I mean, I do hope that. But I think the main reason that I wrote the book is because I think that what you're saying is true. Most people feel this way that we're describing about these classic stories and about this idea of womanhood. Most people love these stories. I mean, since starting to write about this, I go to these sort of like Disney events, right? These kind of like sing-alongs and like concerts and things, and they're packed. They're packed with
Absolutely.
people like people my age, and they're with adult people who love these stories, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think, but a lot of times they love them sort of apologetically, right? I know, Ariel gives up her voice for a guy,
I just can't help it. Guilty pleasure.
Exactly. And I want to say, no, this is not your guilty pleasure. This is legitimately worthwhile. And so, I think that since we're saying, oh, most women really do love these stories, and most women, that's why I take the tone that I do. I don't think that most of us sitting around in our homes reading that HuffPost article or that Times article agree with it. I think that is a vocal minority. I think that they get into the mainstream. I think that, they get into the mainstream publications and they get interviewed by news sources that agree with them.
Right.
But I think that most of us are much more moderate and much more kind of, like you say, sort of like second wavy and like wanting to kind of agreeing that women should have equal opportunities and, that we're people of worth and that we have value and all of these things, but that, but not the sort of crazy out there, like, shouldn't be any men or whatever it is kind of thing. And so I think the idea is not so much that we need to kind of like take down these people because they're trying to take over the world. I think the idea is, look, there's not that many of them.
That's
right?
true.
It looks like there are.
They run the culture, though.
Right. Absolutely. Right. They have a hold. They have their sort of claws into the culture, and that's absolutely true. And the rest of us are sort of sitting around getting on with the business of actual life. We're raising our children and we're doing our laundry and we're going to work, and we don't write books or have podcasts or write articles.
And we don't have their op-ed in our heads as we're watching The Little Mermaid, right? We're just loving the movie.
We're just loving the movie. And so I think, that's kind of what I want to say. I don't want to fight them with their weapons. I don't want to screech at them and throw things at them.
That's very Disney princess of you, right?
Oh,
grace and class, right? And
that's right.
Integrity.
Well, they taught me, right? I mean, that's exactly right? Like I don't want to behave the way that they behave because I actually don't think that they're worth it. It's not. It's not like a war in which they have a big army and we are sort of the kind of the rebels. We are actually the majority. We just need to know. We just need to know that. And so I think if we can kind of reorient our thinking such that when we read, some article, it's not like, oh my God, they're taking over the world. It's like, they don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
Then we can just kind of go about our lives being who we are and thinking what we think, and they can sort of fall by the wayside. Goodbye.
Yeah, right. And so what I think your book does is it reinstills confidence in people who already unabashedly love these great fairy tales, And maybe if we can sell enough of your books, we can have another Disney princess renaissance. I want to talk about, you had a great chapter about Cinderella, and I'll quote you here. You say, even though princess critics want us to favor feminist princesses like Mulan or Merida, because of their strength and their agency, Cinderella is actually Disney's most popular princess. It's true, and this is still a quote by you. A poll conducted by the secret sharing app Whisper that asked a whopping 80,000 people to reveal their favorite Disney princess crowned Cinderella #1. Mulan and Merida didn't even make the top 5, obviously. And you say, in fact, Elsa from Frozen was the only feminist princess to make the cut. You also say that, quote, almost every culture in the world has a Cinderella story. According to the American Library Association, more than 500 versions of that tale have been documented in Europe alone, with its roots dating back as far as the 9th century. I did not actually know that, Faith. So first of all, why do so many people see Cinderella as sort of the ultimate Disney princess? And secondly, what is it about the story of Cinderella? What is it about that story that resonates so deeply with us as human beings? And as you said, these modern woke princesses don't even make the list. People still are connecting with Cinderella, even if the feminists who think they're living in The Handmaid's Tale would try to deny that fact. We all love Cinderella. What is it? So first of all, why do so many people see Cinderella as the ultimate princess? And what is it about that story that resonates with us in a way that's kind of universal?
Yeah, so there is one reason why Cinderella is the most beloved princess, I think. And it's kind of what I was talking about before. It's a story about a person whose inner self, her inner goodness and her inner worth is at first invisible and then visible, right? It's a story about a person who is always completely and truly herself. At first, that's not acknowledged by the people around her. And then it is. I mean, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't feel like there's something about them that they're trying to so desperately to convey to the
Absolutely.
world, and they just don't see it, right? And
that's your book. That's
right. I mean, exactly. This is a sort of symbolic. This story is a symbolic representation of what we all wish could happen. That somehow we could wear on the outside all of the things about us that we're trying to convey to the world, so that everyone around us could see them immediately upon looking at us.
Very good.
And I think that is really that really resonates with people. And on top of that, obviously, it's an incredibly romantic story and an incredibly sort of visually opulent story, even in the original and also obviously in the movie. It's kind of this amazing romance, and we all we gravitate towards that also. But I think really, because not all of the versions of the story that exists throughout time are about a girl who goes to the ball and meets the prince. I mean, there's one where there's a fish, and there's all kinds of different versions. And I guess, underneath all of that, it's kind of the rags to riches story, which is sort of like the American story. And I think it resonates with us in that way also, as a kind of, the sort of scrappy underdog getting her reward at the end, and that's always appealing. But I think it's more than that. I think it's really about this moment of transformation that we kind of long for, and I think that is why it resonates with us, and that's why and Disney does it so well, because I think that visual representation of that transformation is so iconic and so kind of I think even if you haven't ever seen the movie, or you can sort of picture that, the sort of swoosh, and there's the ball gown all of a sudden. And I think that's sort of that is a visual picture of that transformative moment. And I think that really sticks with us.
Yeah, for me, I watched that film, and I actually think about Dickens, right? I think about this sort of orphan type girl living in poverty, overworked, stressed out, right? This sort of great expectations, coming of age sort of thing. And she does have great expectations in a way. And so I do love that story. I want to get on to Little Mermaid. I think my favorite part of your book is the Renaissance Part 2 section, where you start talking about what's that?
Those are the best movies.
Oh, God. And and those are the movies that I grew up with,
Yeah.
right? I still have all the VHS tapes of those movies. I want to give you my take of The Little Mermaid, and I want to
Lay it
see I want to see what you think of this, because this is I got into a little bit of a Facebook battle. It was a polite Facebook battle, but this was when Keira Knightley came out, and of course, when you're a famous celebrity, you say one little thing about a Disney film, and it gets everyone talking about it.
Yep.
And then, of course, so one of my colleagues posted that she was frustrated. This was actually my boss. She posted that she was frustrated that people feel this way about a movie like The Little Mermaid, and she was sort of making the anti-censorship argument that let's let our kids decide for themselves how they feel about this movie and if they connect to it. It's good to have an English teacher boss like that.
That's right. That's pretty good. Yeah.
So the way I responded was this, and I'm actually going to read you what I wrote because I was thinking about it on the way to work. I saw it on my phone. I was thinking about it, and I get to work and I typed this up, and this really is my take. I just watched Little Mermaid last night. This is my take. The Little Mermaid isn't just about a girl who gives up her voice for a man. That, to me, is the radical feminist reading. It's about an independent young woman / mermaid who defies her father and the patriarchy to make a life for herself. She leaves the safety of conservative order, and here I'm using Jordan Peterson language, risks everything and finds love. She inspires agency and autonomy in women. It's also about shedding the identity that your patriarchal society assigns to you, that is mermaidhood, and crossing the threshold to become something new and self-determined. So I'm actually kind of using the language of victimhood a little bit. I apologize for that. It's the hero's journey undertaken by a badass redhead. I was trying to speak the language that these women that were in the thread would understand. She leaves the ordered homeland in which she'll have to serve her father and likely enter into an arranged marriage, crosses the threshold, enters the domain of chaos, and sacrifices a piece of herself to defeat the dragon that guards the treasure. The treasure would be Eric. Classic archetypal story. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think the reason I'm laughing is because there's absolutely a super, super kind of radical feminist take that you can make, a radical feminist critique that you can make of this movie, in which Ariel is this amazing heroine, right? Because that's
what I was trying to do.
You can say like she's transhuman, right? Yeah. You can say like, she was born in a mermaid body, but she was meant to be a person, and she, goes through all this stuff and becomes a person. And I think that always amuses me, because I don't know why nobody makes that argument on that.
That's what I'm saying. It's not necessarily that's my ultimate take.
Exactly.
But if I were, this appears to me to be the 1960s feminist who grew up loving these films defense of Little Mermaid, and I think it's a fine defense. Now, another observation I made, and you'll probably think this is far-fetched, and certainly the radical feminist types won't like this, but I honestly think this. When was Little Mermaid directed? It was directed in 1988, 1989. Okay,
came out. Yeah.
So I honestly believe, you can tell me what you think about this, that Ursula is meant to be a kind of bitter, resentful, nasty woman feminist type. Jordan Peterson actually argues that Ursula is the Jungian archetype of the devouring mother. And so here's a clip of Jordan Peterson describing this archetype.
In our domestic, normal, everyday, quotidian lives, what is the terrible mother? How does that help us?
Overprotection.
Don't overprotect the baby. Let it fall over a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. You do the least amount possible for your children. It's something like that. That's not neglect. It's nothing like that. It's like the old age home adage. Look, I've seen this lots of times with parents. It's like, maybe you have to get your kid dressed up to go out. Well, it takes a long time if you let your kid do it. It's a lot faster just to do it. It's a lot faster not to have them set the table. It's a lot faster to do things for them. Plus, there's also, and this is part of the devouring mother archetype, is like, if you've devoted your life to a child, perhaps more than you should have, let's say, then it's very difficult to let the child go, because what's there left for you? And so there's this terrible temptation to play, well, I'll do everything for you, but you never leave me. And then for the child to say, yeah, that's right, that's exactly the right face to make for that. That's a very terrible thing. And you see that again in Disney's Sleeping Beauty, where Maleficent has the heroic prince in the dungeon and is laughing at him. Right? She's not going to let him go until he's ancient. And that's and that's a consequence.
Where else do we see the devouring mother? What are some good pop cultural examples of the devouring mother?
You see it in Disney movies all the time.
They've always got one.
In the Little Mermaid, Ursula is the devouring mother. The devouring mother shows up all the time. She's the witch. She's the swamp dweller. She's the evil queen in Snow White.
What's the counterpoint? The fairy godmother?
Yeah, fairy godmother's one. Yeah, that's the positive feminine. And that happened, that archetype manifests itself all over the place as well. The fairy godmother is a good one. And you see in Sleeping Beauty, there's three of them, the three little fairies that take care of the princess in the forest. They're the archetype of the positive feminine.
So you can see the devouring mother is someone who so overprotects and smothers their children, their young child, that they ultimately render them weak and ineffectual, incapable of acting autonomously in the world, right? And so I actually think that Ursula is a kind of combination between the archetype of the devouring mother, which is something that's in a lot of Disney films, right? That's in Snow White, that's in Sleeping Beauty, that's in almost all Disney films, the sort of jealous witch that somehow tries to render the main characters weak and unself-autonomous. So basically, Ursula does this to Ariel, right? Ursula has all of these mer people trapped in her lair, and they're basically these weird creatures that can't do anything. This is the archetype of the devouring mother, right? This is the mommy wanting to keep her infant around forever, right? And so the feminists are saying this is Ariel giving up her voice, right? But I think of Ursula as a kind of evil sea witch feminist, right? Think about it. Ariel wants to marry her perfect prince, Eric, and he's a good guy. He's brave. He's heroic. He's attractive. He's manly, right? But Ursula can't have that, right? And she can't have that. She does not want Ariel to be happy. She does not want Ariel to take what she wants in life, to find true love, to find happiness. And of course, this is reflected in the sense that Ursula is not even willing to play fair, right? Ursula sabotages Ariel and doesn't even let it happen. So basically, so eventually we find out ultimately that beyond wanting to corrupt something as pure and as wonderful as Ariel, I was watching the movie last night, this all turns out to be a game to take down the patriarchy, right? Because King Triton is the person that she's ultimately after. She says, okay, I'll let you go as long as I can have your father, King Triton, who is both the tyrannical father and the benevolent father, right? And so she is literally trying to bring down the patriarchy represented by King Triton. He's the wise father, but he's also the sort of tyrannical father. So that's my take on The Little Mermaid, right? That feminists hate The Little Mermaid because it's about a strong, passionate, redheaded woman, my wife's a redhead, who defeats the evil man-eating third-wave feminist witch and gets her man, a man whom it turns out the disguised Ursula fails to win herself. So this is the hero's journey, and the sea witch is the feminist.
Right. So I think that one of the things that's going on there is that Ursula is, I'm not totally sure I buy the mother part, because I think Ursula's main thing is that she's after power and that she's willing to use, this is the way that I sort of equate her with feminists, is that she's after power and she's willing to use anything, even her body, to win it. And so I think, her advice to Ariel about how to get a guy is to use body language. And she's kind of
body language,
right?
Yeah.
She's grotesque, right? But it's a sort of like sexual grotesqueness. Like, she's got the hips and the boobs and, and the lipstick, and all of that stuff. And I think, and that's, for her, sort of the way that you kind of take over. You use your kind of feminine wiles to kind of confuse the men and get them out of the picture so that you can take over the power. And that's really what she's after. And so I think, that's her kind of link to modern feminism, is that they're sort of, they see, modern feminists really see their sexual power over men as a power, It's something that they can use. It's not, it's not a way that people can join together. It's a way that they can take
Right.
people down. And so I think, there's that. And for this whole idea about she gives up her voice, I think Ursula takes away her voice because her voice is the thing that is most likely to get Eric to fall in love with her. I mean, that's the problem with
That's
this
brilliant.
argument, is that if so Ursula obviously wants Ariel to fail. And in fact, as you say, when Ariel looks like she's going to succeed, Ursula kind of reneges on the deal and sort of like does all this stuff to try to get her to stop. And so her plan has to be, I'm going to take away the thing that is most likely to get Eric to fall in love with her. And she doesn't choose beauty, right? She could have said, you can go up there and you can have your voice, but
It's
you're going to
her
be an
voice.
ugly old hag.
That's
right?
so feminist. It's her
Right.
voice.
She takes away her voice. And the amazing thing is, Eric doesn't actually fall in love with her when she doesn't have a voice, right? He falls in love with her initially because he hears her sing, and that's her voice,
Right.
And then when she comes back and she's like, I don't have a voice, he's like, oh, you can't possibly be the woman that I fell in love with. She had the most beautiful voice. And then, he's kind of like, oh, well, maybe I'll marry her. She seems nice. And he's kind of convinced that was a dream before about the woman that was singing. And, so he's like, okay, fine. She seems nice enough. And it's the moment when she gets her voice back. I mean, she looks the same, right? But she gets her voice back and he's like, oh my God, it was you. It was you the whole time.
Right.
And so I think, that's the problem, is that like, they don't read it in that way, but it's obviously meant to be that,
Right. That's a great argument, that it couldn't be a more, a less anti-feminist film. I mean, it is her voice that Eric is lured to, and there's a sense in which her voice represents her soul or something like that, because
it's the her of her,
Right.
It's
The
her
essence.
sort of inner self, her essence. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, she gives up her voice because she has to. That's the terms of the deal, right? She didn't say, hey, let me just give up my voice and I'll go. I
Right.
mean, those were the terms of the deal. And not only that, she's getting something else that she wants in that bargain, which is to be human.
Her legs.
Right. She wants legs. And I think that's what she wanted to begin with. She didn't know Eric at first. When we first meet her, she's like obsessed with human culture, right? She's obsessed with being human, and she didn't know she could become human. If she knew that, maybe she would have gone for that to begin with, but because she says to Ursula, you can do that. She didn't know.
Right.
And so, she's getting something that she wants. Eric is sort of the catalyst, right? Like a lot of people in life, right? Their love is kind of a motivating force. And so she kind of is motivated to get this thing. And her love for Eric is tied up with her getting to stay a human being. But that's really what she wants. She wanted to be human, and she wanted to get Eric, and she gives up her voice because she has to. And she doesn't actually succeed without her voice. He doesn't really fall in love with her that way.
And it's symbolic of the transformation that happens when you do fall in love with someone, is that the transformation from becoming a mermaid to becoming a full-fledged human being is symbolic of the kind of change. When you fall in love with someone and you marry them, you become one flesh. That's the symbolism. You change, you transform. And so there's that transformation process happening. Right. So, I loved the chapter that you wrote on Ariel, because you start it talking about, you begin that section with instructions for how to dress up like a little mermaid, which was really cute. There was a quote that struck me in that chapter. It really struck me, and it got me thinking. It was from Roger Ebert, whom you rely on a decent amount in the book for analysis. And I want to read the quote from that chapter. It's kind of a lengthy quote. In his 1989 review of the film, Roger Ebert called Ariel, quote, a fully realized female character who thinks and acts independently, even rebelliously, instead of hanging around passively while the fates decide her destiny. And so what you're talking about here in this chapter is the way people used to think about these Disney films. And so you reflect on that and you say, Look, this wasn't some damsel in distress. This was a true to life young woman, Ebert implies, with a mind of her own and the ability to shape her own destiny. It was a sentiment echoed in other major publications at the time. And you go on to say the New York Times called Ariel a rebellious heroine, and you're quoting the New York Times, a spunky, flirty little nymph who defies her father's wishes, and says she's, quote, even capable of wit, which is more than could ever be said of Snow White or Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella. And then you quote the New York Daily News, who calls her a rebellious redhead, right? So I'm going to keep quoting you here. Many reviewers pointed to the fact that Ariel actually saves Eric rather than the other way around, and that she takes control of her own destiny by making a deal with the Sea Witch when no one will help her, as evidence of her feminist leanings. It was as if she was directly answering the princess critics who were beginning to say that Disney princesses were too passive, waiting for their prince to come and solve all their problems. This came in large part from the filmmaker's conscious effort to model her after a rebellious teenager. Director Ron Clements said of Ariel, "We wanted her to feel like a real teenager, so we looked at movies about teenage girls." In short, and this is the end of the quote here, critics and parents signed off. The Little Mermaid was A-OK for girls to watch, and watch it we did. So that was, again, a quote from your book, Saving Cinderella, What Feminists Get Wrong About Disney Princesses and How to Set It Right. Excellent quote. It really got me to thinking, because here's my problem with this sort of never-ending progress for progress's sake, progress with no endpoint, absurd cycle that we're stuck in. What struck me about that quote is that nothing is ever going to be good enough for the princess critics, right? Snow White was perfectly acceptable when it came out. In fact, it was innovative, it was groundbreaking, but eventually that became problematic. Okay, then Cinderella comes out. Oh, what a strong-willed woman Cinderella is. Nope, a few years later, that's problematic is the word that they use. That's also problematic. Then the Disney Renaissance. Oh man, Ariel's fierce and independent and rebellious. Nope, now that's problematic. So my question to you, Faith, in terms of where you see this going, is where is the end point? Where does this end? And I guarantee you that Brave, right, is next on the chopping block. It seems that the radical feminists who dislike these Disney films won't be satisfied until all of the Disney princesses are men, right? So
Yeah.
Where do we go from here? Because it seems like both sides are living in different moral universes. How do we take Disney princesses back before things implode?
Right. So I think what's happening is there's this interplay between Disney, the studio, and these critics, these princess critics, right? Where, the Disney is trying to make money. Obviously, that's its main goal, and it should be. It's a company.
Right.
It's an entertainment company, right? That's what it's trying to do, and it wants to give. So it should be wanting to give the people what it wants. It doesn't know what the people want,
right?
Because, like we were talking about before, we are not, we're not telling them, right? Like the princess critics are saying all of this stuff, and then also people are reading the princess critics and sort of blindly saying like, yeah, okay, that, and so then we're getting this. The one caveat to that is that Disney actually makes more money a lot of the times from its more traditional princess movies than its less traditional ones. For example, Tangled, which is the story of Rapunzel and is incredibly traditional of a story, made a huge amount of money for Disney, whereas like Pocahontas was kind of a flop. So there's a little bit of like, obviously Disney has hired people who subscribe to this philosophy also in a bid to try to make enough money, et cetera. It's very complicated in that way. So I think that the first thing that has to happen is obviously we have to start saying, we the fans and we the regular people need to kind of start being more vocal about what we want. I actually interviewed a bunch of fans and asked them, and the majority of them were kind of like, no, I don't like these kind of weird feminist princesses. I want to go back to the originals. And I think the other thing that I kind of hope will happen is I kind of hope that what you just said might happens. I kind of hope that like they push it so far to the other end that it's ridiculous. And then nobody comes to the movies, and then Disney's like, what the heck is going on? And then we kind of come full circle again. I think that there is a point at which like no one would come to the movie, if something so ridiculous was going on in the movie. For example, like this princess is a man. I think that then Disney's not going to totally fold based on this this ideology, right? So if people stop coming to the movies, they're going to have to rethink their philosophy, right? So I think a couple of things will/should happen. One is that, if they go too far, then we won't watch the movies and then they'll have to pull back. And the other is that I hope that, if we all can kind of figure out what we actually think and believe, and this is kind of what I hope the book will do for people, is kind of help them figure out why they love these movies so much and why they're so important to our culture, then we can sort of start to be more vocal and kind of take them back.
Great. Faith Moore, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on the Western Canon podcast. I am going to make this an isolated episode. It was really great talking to you, as it always is with the Klavan family. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was super fun.
That was great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.